Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today, we will actually have a super special webinar episode. We'll do an AMA and Ask Me Anything. And I am joined today by one of our wonderful principal investigators, Dr. Swathi Varanasi, who is here to answer any of your questions from the research perspective. And then we'll also have here with us Heather Bustos, who's the owner and partner of Bustos Law Group, and is here to answer any of your legal questions. And in case you don't know who I am, my name is Suzanne Mitschke. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citruslabs, and Citruslabs is the leading provider of decentralized clinical trials for brands. We work with supplements, superfoods, cosmetics, and also pet health products. And typically at the end of a clinical study, our clients get substantiated product claims. And if you're interested in conducting your own research, you can contact us at hello@citruslabs.com and can visit us at citruslabs.com on our website. And because this is an AMA, we need your questions. So please put them into the Q&A box of the Zoom or in the chat, and we will answer them. Now, to kick us off, Swathi, Heather, could you briefly introduce yourself, starting with Swathi?
Yeah, sure. So can you hear me? All good? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I am Dr. Swathi Varanasi. I just go by Swathi, or Dr. Swathi is fine. I'm an integrative pharmacist. So that means that I'm a pharmacist that's passionate about preventative health, about integrative health, and always thinking about what is best for the patient. And at the end of the day, like, I'm always searching for opportunities to improve patient outcomes. And a lot of the time that does come from leveraging clinical research or technology, or both in some cases. I'm really passionate about clinical research, especially when it comes to brands and providing evidence-based perspective to their consumers, because at the end of the day, this is what consumers want. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is the ongoing trend that this is what consumers are looking for, is for evidence-based products. And so I've had the pleasure of working in patient care, but also academia, in the health food CPG space, as well as the tech space. And as Suzanne mentioned, I'm one of the PIs at Citruslabs.
Awesome. Heather, what about you?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on here. I'm Heather Bustos. I am the managing partner of Bustos Law Group. We are FDA compliance counsel for brands regulated by the FDA, also by the FTC. I help companies in the food, supplement, cosmetic, and medical device spaces. And these are companies from manufacturers and distributors to importers and brand owners. Some of the services we provide, some examples are labeling and marketing reviews, quality control compliance, registrations. We help also get some brands out of trouble. So things like import issues, recalls, warning letters. And it's basically me, a team of lawyers, and also consultants who are subject matter experts. And, we help clients in those spaces.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for being here with us. Now, obviously, we also received a couple of questions, so we will start with them. So some of the questions might overlap, and some of them are just for either Heather or either Swathi. And Heather, could you tell us a little bit about the most important regulatory requirements that brands should be aware of?
In terms of studies, so I would say, obviously one of the big ones is getting IRB approval, which I'm sure you're really familiar with, both of you. So the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, it's a group that is formally designated to review and monitor research involving human subjects. So it's really important that you get approval before the study starts. As well, you want to make sure your participants, you're getting informed consent. So making sure that they're signing their consent forms, that they understand, what's happening. I also think of HIPAA when I think of the regulatory requirements. So like data privacy, um, adverse event reporting is another one. So making sure that if anything, were to go wrong, that it's reported. And that's usually, it has to be a serious health consequence for the need to report. And then finally, good clinical practice. So making sure, the studies are ethical and of good scientific quality. So those are some examples of regulatory requirements for studies and when you're designing a study.
Yeah, very important. Swati is dealing with the IRB all the time, making sure
Sure.
that every ducks are in a row, right? And in terms of consent, in terms of adverse events, everything. So very well aware of that. And Swati, how do you actually see the role of clinical trials and research evolve specifically in the health and wellness industry, also given that you're working with a lot of brands?
Yeah, and I couldn't help but mention it even in my intro, but I just think that more and more this is what consumers are wanting to see. And so I think that the role of clinical research, not only is it evolving in the best way possible, but it's also just meeting the consumers where they're at and where their needs are. And so I think that there's more of a demand than ever for having evidence-based products, or really what that means is clinically backed products. So products that have been tested in clinical trials, that are robust, that have, the right sample size, that have control groups, all of those things, right? And so I think that not only is there this need or like ongoing desire now for evidence-based products, there's also, what sort of methods are being involved in those studies, and those are also evolving. And so, the use of technology. So whether that's, digital biomarkers or trackers, different things like that, I see that as an ongoing trend. And also too, like beyond consumers, if we're thinking about the other kind of end user, or not even end user, but someone else that's involved in this process, is the healthcare provider. And even healthcare providers are getting more and more interested in like, okay, if I'm going to talk to my patient about this product, they're also interested in seeing what clinical trials have been done with it and where can they find this information. Is it clinicaltrials.gov? Is it published in a journal? And they're also getting interested in it too. So I see it from like a very multi-pronged perspective of like this evolution of the importance of clinical research, especially within non-FDA approved products.
And Swati, when you are designing a study, what would you say are like the common pitfalls that you frequently see when you work with brands? They also want to kind of, tweak the study design a little bit. Um, what is it that these brands often get wrong about study design, and what are the pitfalls?
Yeah, so I would say some of the pitfalls, and this is like a lot of the studies that I'm evaluating that are not done through Citruslabs, and maybe they're published or, they're publicized in different ways, is, they're not using sample size that actually achieve power. And so that might be really complicated terminology for people who are not as familiar with clinical trials. But when and before you do a clinical trial, it's really important to evaluate if we are going to do statistical analyses on, this product and this test product in this way in the study, we need to have a certain number of participants involved in the study for the results to even quote unquote, kind of be validated or make sense. And so that's one of the pitfalls I see when people are doing kind of clinical trials on their own, or just asking their, 10 best friends or family members to try something and then use percentages based off of that. It's like, that's not robust, first and foremost, but also the sample size is not really big enough to make some of those sweeping claims that they're trying to make. So that's definitely one of the things I see. I think there's a huge need of, when you are setting up a clinical study, to have control groups, or to have, and that's also maybe fancy terminology for someone who doesn't know what that means. But, if you see a clinical trial, it's often called a randomized, sometimes placebo-controlled trial. And so that means that there's more than one group. There might be one group trying out the test product. That might be from a brand, that might be from a manufacturer. And then the other side would be a control. So that's someone or a participant who's not taking the test product, so that we can really evaluate the difference between the test product versus no product at all. And so that's something I often see. And so maybe, and there's still a lot of value to having a single group study, but at the end of the day, when we're really looking for robust, substantiated claims, that's a pitfall that I see often as well. The other thing, apart from those two, I would say is that the study duration oftentimes is just too short. And if you're trying to make, especially for a skincare product or a supplement product, that might not work overnight. You might see some effects overnight, which is awesome, but to really see the long-term benefits of some of these active ingredients, you really need to have a longer study duration. This again adds to the robustness of the study, but also with all of these different factors of having the length of the study be long enough, having a control group, but also having enough people in the study or having the sample size be large enough, that's really when you start getting closer to a great clinical trial, wherefrom you can get really incredible results and therefore substantiated marketing claims. But those are probably three of the main things. And then kind of a pet peeve of mine is when I see things that are, the scientific terminology for it is like a confounding variable. So it's like when certain aspects of the people that are involved in the trial might actually be interfering with the result of the trial. So this might be if they are testing a gut health product, but the participants are already taking certain gut health products that might be new to their regimen. So then you honestly don't know if it's from this brand new product they just started 3 days before the trial, or if it's from the test product itself that are both targeting the same, symptom or the same thing. So that's something I see often as well. And oftentimes these other, brands that are doing trials, they're not necessarily stating like, oh, these participants were taking these other things. But if you look into the details, you realize that it's not being controlled for those things. And so those are, probably 3 or 4 of the top things that I find that really, need to be at a certain level. And I think working with like the right CRO or the right, research team really helps mitigate some of those issues.
So it's sample size, number of study groups, RCTs, randomized controlled trials, or placebo-controlled trials, double-blind placebo-controlled studies, another term for that. And study duration are very important. And then they should also look at confounding variables.
Yes, exactly.
That's great. And I think one thing, and Swati, correct me if I'm wrong, but one thing that we also see more and more specifically for supplements is that supplements are pushing for publications. And obviously, if you want to get a publication, then if you are conducting an RCT over a single group study, it is way more likely to actually get published in a journal.
Exactly. And that's something that I think brands maybe don't know before going through the publication process, is that they want to be published in a journal. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's great. But certain aspects of the study need to meet a certain standard to even be considered for publication. And so I think even before the study begins, there needs to be those preliminary discussions of like, is publishing in a journal of interest? And if so, we need to go about things in a very specific way to ensure that we're making it, the most viable study to be published, because so many studies want to be published in journals and oftentimes only very few get selected.
Exactly. And then Heather, from your perspective, from a legal perspective, what do you think are like the most common pitfalls that you see in study design, and also specifically which study designs, often get challenged?
I mean, I was probably going to say similar to what Swati said, like the sample size. One thing that came to mind while she was talking that I recently had a challenge from FTC on was in the cosmetic space on the diversity within the participant groups. So that was something I hadn't seen before, and it happened recently where the FTC, if they see that you don't have enough diversity within the skin types, then I saw a challenge there, and that was really interesting. Swati, have you seen something like that? You're shaking your head. I imagine you've seen that too.
So I have seen that. That didn't come to mind when Suzanne asked the question, but I've definitely seen that as, something where, especially even if you just like scroll through some of the before and after photos you see. So even not even thinking from a clinical research standpoint, but that is something that I've seen that, oftentimes there's not a lot of diversity. And then, I think about from a clinical trial, how can you really extrapolate that to the much larger population of the US that is quite diverse? Yeah.
That's very interesting with diversity. So typically, when, especially in skincare, typically our clients already know, we want X percent in Fitzpatrick 1, 2, 3, and X percent in like 4 to 6. That's typically what we see. But very interesting that this also got challenged. We got one client who actually got asked about the diversity in their study, which also was, because obviously also when you're looking at drugs in particular as well, the FDA also wants to see a more diverse background of study participants. So yeah, it's very obvious that this is also going, now into also cosmetics and supplements as well. And then there's one question in the Q&A, and that person wants to know what are the legal or FDA requirements for a consumer perception study. I think that's for Heather.
Yeah, so I mean, it's consumer perception studies from like a claims perspective. Let's just talk about it from that side. So usually it's regulated more on the FTC side than on the FDA side in terms of, what types of substantiation are required for the types of claims made. So if it's a consumer perception study, and I've been working with quite a few clients more recently on this because a lot of brands may assume that the results of a consumer perception study allow them to make claims that are way outside the bounds of what's allowed. And that's a misconception. So when you're making claims that are a result of a consumer perception study, and I know Citruslabs does this really well, where you guys give examples of some of the claims and you always include in there, X percentage of participants said XYZ. If you're trying to make an outright claim where you're not making it, fairly obvious that it was the result of a consumer perception study, the way that I think about it in like the simplest terms is consumer perception study is you're making claims about what people thought of your product, not necessarily what the product can actually do and what the results will actually be. And so I would say in terms of those types of studies, you really, and I think Swathi touched on this, consumers are they're becoming more aware. I mean, I'm not saying that, everybody knows everything about studies, but they're definitely becoming more educated. I think with the rise of like TikTok and social media, where, you have people that are teaching on these platforms, they're becoming more and more educated. And so ultimately, aside from the regulatory side, which of course, the FTC will come in if you're making claims outside of what you should be, you want to make sure that you're not being misleading with your claims and that you're making it very obvious that the type of study that's supporting your claims is a consumer perception. So it's in the claim, but also including something like an asterisk below your claims where you're stating it was a consumer perception study with participants from this age range, things like that. The more you're able to provide information wise, the better you're going to be seen by regulatory agencies.
Yeah, I would love to add to that too. And, whether it's a consumer perception study or even a clinical trial as well, that's something that I've seen too, is that some of the companies we work with are kind of afraid almost to be completely transparent with the results they had. And I think from a credibility standpoint, I would rather see a brand say, hey, here were the limitations. Here are all the nitty-gritty details of exactly what we did. I would trust them a lot more to be like, oh, wow, they still achieved X percentage of efficacy with their product, but at the same time, they're willing to be transparent about all these other things. And so I think that that would only help brands, but I think brands are really afraid of that. And I think that they tend to even like oversimplify the results, and they're not giving the consumer enough credit. I think right now, more than ever, the consumer is, as you mentioned, Heather, quite educated and is getting more and more educated. So I think we should give the consumer a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt sometimes. And provide them, all the information. And I think that the FTC would also love that we're providing all the information, or the brands rather, providing all the information rather than kind of cherry picking certain things. Another thing that I would also say is that I think brands also get really weary of like, oh, if it's like a 76.6%, can I say 77? And like those sorts of things where they think it's very, very simple to just round up. But at the end of the day, and I'm sure Heather, you would agree, we always say, you know, you should round down to the full whole number. And so certain things like that, where I'm like, I wish brands would kind of realize like the importance of being transparent, not only from the FTC perspective, but also I feel like consumers would really resonate with it more than they think.
Yeah, I agree. And being more conservative sometimes is better off. I mean, I've been on the other side of things where you've got the FTC nitpicking and picking apart every part of your study. And that's where you don't want, those questions to come up. So as much as, a lot of brands try to push for these stronger claims or higher percentages, sometimes it is better. And I do agree, the consumer, you're going to have more, credibility with the consumer if you're more conservative and you're being as honest and truthful as possible. Because I mean, there are these like internet sleuths now that'll like find you out. They'll figure it out if you're, not being honest. So I think it's better off to be conservative and try to be, as honest as possible with the results.
And I also think that the reason why we are seeing more regulation from the FTC side on claims, but also, the FTC being a little bit more nitpicky when it comes to, studies and claims and marketing, right, is because they want brands to be transparent and want brands to be honest. So I think the more transparent, everyone is with their claims and with their study and also what study they've conducted, I think the less likely they are getting in trouble. And what really drives me crazy, and I'm not sure if this is, something that brands do occasionally on purpose, or they just don't know better, is that they kind of claim that they've conducted a clinical while it actually was a perception study. So that's something that you definitely shouldn't do.
Well, yeah, no, and you're 100% right. And the thing is, it's not just the regulatory agencies, guys. It's lawyers, plaintiffs, attorneys that are filing lawsuits against companies for making those types of claims as well. So even if, because obviously the market is massive, right? Who knows whether the agency will find you or not. And they're kind of picking a needle out of a haystack. But in terms of these plaintiffs' lawsuits, a lot of attorneys are kind of sitting by and looking for brands to go after. And the clinically proven is one of the really hot ones right now that I'm actually working with a few clients that have claimed clinically proven when it's not. And in some cases it was consumer perception, which definitely does not rise to that level. So it's important to, understand what those terms mean: clinically proven, clinically backed, all of those things, clinically reviewed. They have different meanings, and the FTC will come down on you, as well as these plaintiffs' attorneys. And once you're in a lawsuit, there's no backing out. Like, you're gonna end up spending some money regardless. So it's better to try to be as conservative as possible.
That's
So
something
let's talk about it.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, no, I
was
just wanted to, sorry. I wanted to talk about these terms.
Yeah.
Swati, Heather, what is your definition of clinically proven?
So to me, I'll go first, but then I would love to hear Heather's
cool.
perspective
Go
too.
ahead.
Clinically proven to me is that it has been proven in numerous studies with, the correct samples, correct as in a powered sample size for the correct duration, for a longer duration. And these studies are really robust, but there are many of them. Like, I want to see quite a few studies. I would love to see them either, reporting their results on clinicaltrials.gov. They're in, academic journals of note. And so clinically proven, very, very few supplements, I think, out there can say the words clinically proven, just given the fact that most of them haven't done enough robust research on one specific product to say that. That would be my definition of clinically proven. And for that reason, we try to recommend, or not try to, we do recommend, whether or not the brands listen to us is a different story, but we do recommend that none of our brands use clinically proven. Anyone who's done one study with us, two studies with us, absolutely not. That's not appropriate. That's at least what we say. But would love to hear, Heather, from you, how you would classify clinically proven.
I agree with you. I agree with you. It's definitely a much higher bar, and I don't recommend clients to make that claim at all, unless they've got really, really strong substantiation. You know, there's that, but then there's clinically tested, which is very different. It just means it's been tested, you know, in a clinical environment. That's a much more conservative claim to make. Clinically proven, to me, almost every brand that I've worked with has not risen to that level. And so I agree. I don't advise brands to make it. I know it's like a really hot word like to use, and people think that, you know, it's going to make a massive impact in the market. I think clinically tested can have a similar effect for consumers without putting you into that territory of risk with, you know, administrative agencies.
Yep, I definitely agree. And that's why, you know, when brands ask like what type of term can we use associated with it, we always say no to clinically proven. But I do think clinically tested, if it is a robust clinical trial, would be appropriate. Perhaps not for a consumer perception study, but definitely for a clinical trial.
Agreed.
And then, so actually one of my follow-ups also came into the Q&A. So how, you know, how can you make claims based on existing research? For example, when you have research on single ingredients, for example, and then you use that single ingredient in a blend, can you then make claims based on that? And then also, my follow-up to our conversation was when you know, brands have conducted a study on their product, and then they are also additionally using you know, existing research on the ingredient to make claims. Would that then stack up to clinically proven, or is that still not clinically proven?
I would
It
love to hear
depends.
Heather's perspective first.
I was
And then
gonna say it depends on the claim. You know, and that's always the difficulty here is like context, right? And the types of claims being made. And so many times where I just sit like looking through the dictionary at every single word within the claim to make sure that I'm understanding exactly what's being said. And, you know, a really important point is administrative agencies like the FDA, like the FTC, are looking at claims from the perspective of a lay consumer. So if a consumer were to pick up, let's say, you know, most things now are on the internet, but we'll just say they're going through the aisle of Target, they pick up your product. If they read that claim, what's the impression they're going to get from it? So that's usually how I look at claims as well, and I try to look at it from a consumer's perspective. In terms of using existing research, because I know that was the question, it's exactly what you said. I've had situations where if a claim is being made about a certain ingredient, so let's say, you know, a pretty simple one is like shea butter has moisturizing qualities, right? I'm sure there's plenty of research on that shows, you know, that shea butter moisturizes. I think you can use existing research to substantiate that. And the way that this is regulated, and a lot of people have this understanding that, you know, you need to take all your research and submit it. That's not really how it works. You actually just need to keep a dossier or a file with all of the substantiation for your claims, so that if the FTC were to request it, then you could provide that to them. On the supplement side, you actually are submitting what are called your structure function claims to the FDA. And what they do is they have what's called a memorandum of understanding between the FDA and the FTC, where the FDA, you're submitting the claims that you're making on your product packaging, or, you know, in any of your marketing. So for example, calcium builds strong bones. That's a structure function claim. So you would submit that to the FDA through their system. And what you do at the end of that submission is you're actually certifying that you have the substantiation on hand. And so whenever you submit that, it then bounces over to FTC side. So they're the ones that would, you know, check that the substantiation is at the level that it should be. So like I said, for single ingredients, I think it's fine. When it comes to making claims about how your formulation works together to provide a benefit, that's where you want to have your own studies. So that's usually how I handle the substantiation in terms of existing research.
That's great, and that makes a lot of sense actually. And then we have one question that is on compounded products. So obviously, we're seeing a lot of compounds um, right now in the brand space. So, do they also need testing?
So compounded products, meaning that like they're being made in a compounding pharmacy kind of a thing?
Yeah, that was my question. I was like, is that what's meant by that?
I would assume so. Yeah, maybe like probably OTC compounded products.
Interesting. I mean, I would put it in the same category of like, is it a supplement being manufactured in, in a manufacturing facility and all of these things are being put together? Or is it a pharmacist in a compounding pharmacy putting it together at the same, like both of those need to go through clinical testing. So it's not
Yeah,
like just because it's compounded by a healthcare provider, all of a sudden it doesn't need clinical testing. If
yeah.
I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, I would assume that they probably mean something along the lines of we are now seeing, some sort of compounded Ozempic.
Oh, understood. Okay. Yep, my answer still stands. Yep.
Great.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I would think so as well. It's the same level of substantiation. And then Swathi, you also mentioned at the beginning methodologies, right? And you mentioned, for example, digital markers. And how can brands actually choose the right biomarkers for their studies? And do you think that biomarkers are important to include in studies?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that biomarkers provide, especially biomarkers that we're thinking of. So biomarkers is like a fancy term for something that is objective data that you would get from like a blood test or like a saliva test or urine test, like some sort of those results where it has something to do with, something that's not necessarily I feel like I'm getting warped up in my words, but you guys know what I mean, right? So it's something that is objectively measured, and it generally corresponds with like the biological response of some sort of supplement. So I think including those adds a lot of robustness to studies. I'm saying that R word a lot, but I think it's really important because that's something that the authoritative bodies are going to be looking at is like, okay, they did a clinical study. Cool. But like, how did they set up the study? What are the methods? And at the end of the day, like, what are the endpoints? So like, what are the objectives? And then what actually came out of the study in terms of results? So I think the more objective the results can be, then the less, possibility of bias and things like that, which is certainly something that they're going to be looking at. And so biomarkers from that perspective are great. Kind of the traditional biomarkers are the ones I mentioned that would be coming from blood and things like that. There's also things like digital biomarkers or trackers that I think would be great too, especially if it's something that you're looking for the change in effect over time. And if that time frame between each time point is very short. So if it's like you're looking at how sleep is improving every single day with like a sleep score, that wouldn't necessarily be very valuable doing a blood test to get a specific biomarker for the improvement of sleep. So depending on what you're looking for, you as in the brand, depending on what the brand is interested in evaluating with their test product, I think either like a digital biomarker through a tracker or kind of a more conventional biomarker through a blood test really adds a level of robustness and adds a level of way to validate the outcomes because like what I would say is like the best combination is to use some sort of combination of those biomarkers if it makes sense for the product with a validated questionnaire. A validated questionnaire is like kind of a fancy term for a questionnaire that has been validated, very well named, unlike some things in science, but a questionnaire that has been that has been rigorously tested by specialists in the field to say that, yes, we will use this specific questionnaire and it can be the standard for, quality of life in sleep or quality of life in digestive health, like the DQ, LQ, or something like that, right? So there are different validated questionnaires that can be used, but I would say the study, like the level of standard of the study goes up, and especially when the authoritative bodies are evaluating it, if we use a combination of the validated questionnaires with either a conventional biomarker or a digital biomarker.
And Heather, do you think that the FTC, FDA look at studies differently when they included biomarkers?
I believe so, and it's interesting. I did have a challenge recently with the validated questionnaires. So I mean, a lot of my experience on the study side is just getting the getting the feedback from the agency and then vigorously researching it to figure out what they're talking about, and then determining whether we've met the requirements. So we did have questions about whether there were validated questionnaires, and I learned about that through researching on behalf of a client. They definitely dig into these things. They're not looking surface level. They've got scientists, and this is not just on the FTC. So I know I already talked about like litigation, right? But then there's also this kind of interim place where that is not necessarily a regulatory body, but they do hold a lot of power. It's called the NAD, and it is a branch of the Better Business Bureau, National Advertising Division. And what they do is essentially they're a watchdog for the FTC. So they've got, tons of attorneys that work on staff, and they actually will send letters to brands who have not provided enough substantiation, or if their marketing is misleading in some way. And although they are not an agency like through the federal government, what they do is if you don't comply with what they're asking you to do, they'll actually create a file, they'll get it nice and pretty, and they'll send it right to the FTC and say, here you go, guys. Now you can go in and regulate. So I've had a lot of experience dealing with them as well. And they do the same thing as what the FTC does. They will get very deep into the study, ask very poignant questions about the science behind it and how robust, as you said, how robust the study was and what was done. So it's really important that each of these different aspects, like you said, having a really good CRO, having a really good person on your team who understands these things, because when those questions come, you want to make sure you have really good answers as to, why the study was done and how it was designed.
And Swati and Heather, any last advice for brands?
You want to go first, Swati?
I would just say, like, this is what consumers are looking for now, is they're looking for products that have, data to support their efficacy. And especially given the way the market is trending right now, and people don't really want to spend their products unless they understand that this product is going to have XYZ impact on their quality of life or on a certain component of their life. And so I really do think that now more than ever, people in terms of consumers are interested in clinical research and clinically backed products, or clinically tested products rather, as we discussed today. So I think that should be one of the takeaways of, like, don't underestimate the importance of clinical research and what it's really going to mean for your brand moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think too, if we kind of take a step back, the market is just massive, and there's not one area of the food, the supplement, the cosmetic markets that don't have multiple competitors. So you have to stand out in some way. And this is the way that brands are standing out. And you're seeing it on websites. If you go on a lot of the large supplement companies, you're seeing that they'll have the study linked on their pages because they know that consumers are looking at it. They wouldn't have it otherwise. I mean, part of it could be, CYA for the FTC to make sure they've got what they need. But I think a lot of it is you're seeing the consumers are more and more educated. In terms of advice for brands, I mean, from my perspective, a lot of what's happening right now is around claims. It's happening in all the industries. Like I said, with plaintiffs' attorneys, massive lawsuits, coming to companies like Sephora just had one on the clean beauty stuff. It's happening with foods on the claims like natural. The most important thing to me is just when you're looking at the claims that you want to make, really understand what the claim is trying to say and really think through from like the most basic logic perspective. Do I have what I need to back what this claim is saying? And as conservative as you can be, try to be, because it is really a very difficult legal situation right now where brands are being targeted for the claims they're making. So make sure that you're substantiating your claims, that they're not misleading, and they're not going outside the bounds of, the category in which you sit. So you're not making drug claims as a cosmetic and things of that nature. So for me, that's where I'm seeing a lot of the issues, is the types of claims that are being made.
That's really good advice. Thank you. Thank you both. And before we all hop off, I quickly want to let you know about our next webinar on August 22nd at 10 a.m. PST or 1 p.m. EST, where we will talk about fundraising for brands, also very important topic. And I am joined by Grace Gould, who is a partner at Touch Capital, and we will get into the nitty-gritty of what investors actually want to see when brands raise funds. Now, very briefly, Swathi, Heather, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they find you?
So
I
for
would say
me,
the best way. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, no, you're good. Go ahead.
I would say the best way would be to just email hello@Citruslabs, and then the email can be rerouted to me through that. Or if you want to just DM me on LinkedIn, I'm pretty active there, so we can have a conversation.
Yeah, so for me, you can either reach out to info@bustoslawgroup.com or DM me on LinkedIn. I'm also very active there. If you want to go the traditional route, you can call us 832-592-7851.
Awesome. That's perfect. Well, then, thank you very much, everyone. And I hope to see you all soon.
All right, thank you.
Bye.